this AI stuff is not a fad. Like you gotta be using it, and it's okay to be a little nervous about it. But I would encourage you that just start strengthening that muscle.
And we're back with the Digital Ministry Podcast. We're doing a double header here today, Jay. Thanks for sticking around. If people are watching on the video,
No, I took off my
these guys never
jacket. I
changed
made
their
it so
clothes.
that
Well, these are back.
it looks like you haven't changed.
Yeah, back-to-back recordings, marathon session. So MII attended the Missional AI Conference in Texas last week, and it was great. You can look it up online. If you look on YouTube, avoid the ads. But if you look for Missional AI 2025, they have published all of the sessions, which I think is excellent. There were so many takeaways. You and I have talked about AI a lot, but as I attended some of those sessions, I was just thinking about, this is a really interesting time. So AI, for some people would say that AI had like an AI winter. Have you
Not
ever
for
heard this
AI,
concept
no.
before?
But I mean, I've heard it for other technology like seasons.
Yeah. So like go back to the 90s, like AI is fairly new concept in like, the public conversation today. And everybody's like, enamored by what it can do. And I don't want to take anything away. Like there's some like I was using ChatGPT Operator to book some flights today. Yeah. So I've never done that before. I've played around with it, but I was like, I want to fly business class. I got to go on this international trip. Like find me the best routes, the cheapest price. Still too expensive. I'm going to fly economy, but it can now go out and like book your tickets. So it's really interesting to see like what it can do. But if you go back to like the 90s, early 2000s, like AI was coming on the scene even back then, but it wasn't really like actionable and usable. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from that conference last week is that we've gotten to a point to where you can now build on top of some of these platforms and do some really exciting, actionable things with these tools. And some of those examples are like agents that can, do things like message filtering, which we've put in place at MII. We played around with concepts, and you can build, deep research is kind of an obvious one, where the amount of information that you can pull off of the internet using some of these AI tools. And I would say like Grok is probably the leader for me right now.
Everybody, everybody
like
who's
their
like
deep research tool
techie loves Grok. Like it's the one. I know. What stands out about Grok that like you gravitate towards?
So what I really like is when you select like the deep research model, I usually start, the prompts really matter. That's another big takeaway from last week, is like the prompt engineering and like educating yourself on how to get the best outputs out of these tools, I think is really important. But when you use the deep research model on Grok, I'll upload, a couple of PDFs, like some reports or something. And then I will say, I'm interested in understanding this content a little bit more deeply. And then I'll load in like, here's my website. Here's some things that we've published internally. Like I'm feeding it a lot of information. I'm saying, go out and find the connection between these concepts that aren't obvious to me. And I'll also tell it, and this is, I think a lot of people are doing this now. This isn't like a novel idea, but I'll say like, I'm not trying to buy a house, but like, just as an example, say that like you want to buy a house in town. So like I'll upload kind of like a median household income report that I can find from like my state. I'll upload something about the housing market. And then I'll say something like, you're an expert real estate agent. You've closed, $1 billion worth of deals a year, and you specialize in helping people like me find hidden opportunities in the market. Like your real specialty that you provide for people as a realtor is understanding what properties are undervalued. Maybe they've sat on the market too long, and like it's a good buy opportunity, even with a high interest rate. So I'll give it like this really specific kind of hard use case. And then that deep research model you can watch it and it will consume the PDFs. It'll research the information. It'll start cross-referencing. It follows all the references in those documents. Then it goes out to like publicly available data. It'll go to like a real estate website, like a Zillow or Redfin or something. And it starts looking at local listings that are in my area that fit the criteria. Like, and you can watch it doing all this. And I've given it some really complex stuff. And
Yeah,
it'll
and
take like
I think that's
15
important
minutes.
that if you're watching or listening to this, that there are like default like modes of some of these AI systems, and then the deep research means it could take 5 minutes, it could take 15 minutes, and it will sit there. It feel like early internet, like just loading, but it's because it's actually
Yeah.
it's going to these places, and it's actually like actually crawling these data points, and it's doing a lot of like calculating.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
It's doing deep research. Like that's the right name for it. And then it'll come back and spit out like a long report. And then the final thing that I really like about that tool right now is that it will prompt me for the next question.
Hmm.
So it's like it's got this built-in engagement mechanism where it's like, do you want to know more about this or this? Or if you want me to like summarize this and create something that you can present to, your bank to try to make this deal happen, like I'll put that together for you. So it's like anticipating the next step and prompting me to do it. But back to the Missional AI Conference, there are so many ministries that are using these tools in a really applicable, like meaningful way. It's not just people are using them to make their teams more efficient, of course, but they're also like uncovering kind of these deep insights that in the past either weren't accessible to us or just took so long to really uncover. And I was super encouraged by that. There's some really great thinkers and practitioners in this space right now, and I would just encourage you and everybody else to go listen to some of
It's
those
interesting
sessions.
because we are rolling out kind of AI access to our org at our church right now, and this is something because, and this is one of the
Mm-hmm.
conversations we've been having, is this is a muscle that our team members need to get stronger at, and we understand,
Mm.
like even somebody like me, like I'm however you justify, but I'm fairly tech savvy, but I'm tech sure. I
You're
hate
tech savvy,
when you
Jay.
label yourself that way. Then I
But you're
don't. Somebody will like, well, you're not because you don't know JavaScript. You don't.
you
I'm
can't
like, well,
write
no, I have my
code.
AI bot will do it for me. Don't worry about it. I know.
Yeah,
I
nobody needs
know.
to write code anymore.
I'm like still hoping that becomes more true. You still have to vet the code right now, so like I don't know, but
Yeah, you
as
do.
somebody who used to mess around in the early 2000s on HTML, and that would drive me crazy. I would love to be able to use that. You know, that hasn't been something I've tried out. I need to use some of the code building AI stuff. But the thing is that to your point, the prompting is the really important skill set that you got to be good at. And I want our team members, even some of our volunteers, using some of these platforms. So we were the last couple of weeks I've been putting together a like kind of an AI policy doc for our church and wrestling through. And I've been engaging a bunch of other people in our org that are smart. I go, hey, theologically, is it okay to do this? Like, can we do this? And then giving sample prompts and working through. And we're going to be rolling out like our org uses Google, so we're going to be rolling out like Gemini access and their notebook
Gemini. Mm-hmm.
feature, which is their deep uh, yeah,
Google
notebook's cool.
Notebook
And
is
so, but like
great.
we're going from nobody having access to this to maybe like 150 people having access. But I'm saying, I go, hey, if
Yeah.
everybody is experimenting and using this, I think you'll learn the muscles, how it can be helpful. I was like a couple weeks ago, and this will be like somebody will be listening, like, Jay, why did you never think of it? Well, it's a door I hadn't opened, and I think AI is like it's like this. It's like
Right.
you just haven't tried it yet, and so I'm a guy who's always my brain never shuts up, and I'm always thinking of something. I always have some idea, and it was funny. I had one of the things I struggle with is that I like to write and like jot down my thoughts, and that's why I have a blog. And
Yeah.
I had this idea of a blog, and like I'll write a lot of drafts and then not publish because like I'm like, oh, this is stupid. Like it doesn't make sense. And
I don't
but
like
I
it.
literally
Yeah.
like wrote it out, and then I was like, I should throw this into ChatGPT, like just to see what it would, how would it like take this? And I gave it some prompts, and it populated something, and it was 80% my thoughts, but 20% it made it so much better. And I was like, this is so interesting. This
Yeah.
was so helpful. This was like having it, it was like, it felt like I was like, I've never been in this room, but like if, they talk about this with SNL, like the writers' rooms. And I was like, oh, this
Yeah.
is what a
Yep.
writer's room is, I bet. Like kind of feels like where they make, like sometimes I was doing this a couple of days ago where like my middle son is like always is making jokes. And like I made a joke, and then my wife like said, you should say it this way. And then I said the joke again. I was like, oh, that joke is so much better. That's a great feedback. And like that's where
Yeah.
AI is. It's like a coach. And I ended up like publishing this blog because I was like, this is really good. And my brain went, oh my goodness, I could write so much more if I got better at this.
So do
I
you
do.
use
I do,
the
yeah.
premium subscription? Yeah. So did you create like
So
a J
I
GPT?
I started to feed it. So what I did was I fed it some, like I fed it my website, and I said, hey, write in the tone of it. But I will say, like, that's a
Right.
mechanism. I haven't fully opened that door, but I haven't actually created the agent or anything like that.
So for those that don't know what I'm talking about is if you have the premium version of OpenAI's ChatGPT, you
Mhm.
can create your own custom GPTs. And so we've done this at MII, which we took a bunch of like the training material and I fed it in. So
Mhm.
now it captures like the voice, the context, because you can ask something like build a persona or, what's a good brainstorm 50 ideas for a new ad campaign. And it'll give you all this stuff that's kind of like
Yeah.
more commercial, because like the majority of the internet content out there is about like how do you do this for a business or something. But in that custom GPT, it'll match those concepts with the tone of voice, the intent, the context, and like your own training documents. So it'll start referencing like, oh, in MII University in this module, like you talk about, how to build a persona for this purpose, and it'll like weave in all. It's really good output, and it gets very, very close. Like it took a lot of training of the
Well,
model,
it's
but
it's it is funny
now it's
because
really good.
I was talking to somebody else at my church about this, one of our leaders, and we were talking about creating like an agent that could engage in some of this
Yeah.
stuff. And I was like, it was funny because I mean, some of this is serious and some of this isn't serious, but we were wrestling through. He was like, yeah, we should just do this. And I would be like, I'm like, I love that. And I was like, so one of the things that I'm over right now is our app at our church. And I'm like, it'd be cool to release that on our app, just have like a bait, like, and I go, we just slap beta on it. And then I was wrestling with him. I go, well, one of the things we got to figure out is like, it could hallucinate some things that maybe.
So yeah, the
Yeah, I mean, and
hallucinations are a
and
big
I said,
problem.
hey,
And like,
anybody who uses this stuff understands that problem because the point is even a human hallucinates thoughts, and so like it's a human like you.
sure.
There's all the time that I think something's true and then I realize it's not true, and it's a very human thing, and so the irony is that we are false too all the time. But this is why all you need is like one screenshot of the wrong thing. And that's where the tension that I think AI is in right now is like, how do we wrestle through it being, you know, 90% right, but that 10% being wrong, yeah.
Well, and the 10% that's wrong can usually be,
Yeah, no,
it
100%.
can be
It could
tragic,
really get to a bad place real quick. And I think it is something that you have to wrestle through. So this is why actually we were creating this AI policy was we were trying to, hey, double check your
Yeah.
facts, because this is a good thing, especially with the deep research modes. They will give you all the citations of where they're getting this facts. And
Yes.
if it goes out on some site that doesn't look right, like you'll know. And so like especially with
Right.
theological stuff,
Right.
like you have to wrestle, you have to double check some of the sites. Now you can feed it like align with this creed or align with this denomination, but still you got to double, triple check. And It's still a very powerful tool, but it does require some nuance. And I think that's the muscle. I think like our kids are going to have that muscle a lot.
Well, that's interesting. And I want to talk about like a younger generation here in a minute. I would think of myself as I'm not technically digital native. I think my first computer lab I was in
Mm-hmm.
probably fifth grade when my school got a computer lab and like the internet came out. So I'm like late millennial, early whatever the
I
next
was
one
going to
would
call
be.
you a
What is
boomer,
that?
but
Gen
that was
Z?
going to be mean.
I'm not Gen.
I'm just kidding.
Oh no. I'm late. So I was born in 1980. So it's the gap between Gen X and millennial. So it's like
Yeah.
I didn't grow up from
Yeah.
my earliest memories with the internet. I can still remember like before it, but it was very, very early in my life. Like I'm right.
Exennial. Oh, I haven't heard
Exennial is
that
what they
one.
call it.
Oh, that makes sense
Like,
though. That makes sense based off of the year.
yeah, I
Yeah.
couldn't. But it's like on Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that movie where he like hacks
Yeah.
into the school
Yeah.
computer and changes his absentee record or whatever. I literally had that experience when our computer lab opened and I figured
Yeah.
out like DOS prompt commands. And like I read a book in the library about DOS. This is like fifth or sixth grade. And it's like, oh, if you do directory/W, like you can see the entire structure of
Wow.
the database.
That's awesome.
So like it's a database directory, and then you can start to go access whatever files are in there. And like the school didn't
It was all
realize
it was actually
that
interconnected.
you
Yeah.
had to put
Yeah.
it was all wide open. So like I could go in and look at my grades. I never like changed anything, but like I could go see my buddy's grade. Like, hey, what'd you get on that test?
That's
It was so funny. It was a small Christian school with a computer lab, and to their credit, they like opened it up. They were like,
yeah.
hey, you guys should be using this tech, and we used it. So um anyway, the younger generation, like our kids are growing up kind of like knowing all this stuff, but they're also knowing that danger is lurking. I think they're very aware. And like parents like you've done a great job making your kids aware and talking about having that conversation like, hey, look, don't believe everything you read. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And in our family, I've seen like we have a lot of like it's a kind of a dinner time pastime to, talk
Yeah.
about the conspiracy theory of the day or whatever, which is hilarious. But we're like in this cadence of like, okay, what's real, what's not real, like what cite your sources, what's the proof, like can we corroborate this with some other, you know, source material, so I think kids are pretty savvy about that. But anyway, one of the things I want to say about that conference last week is that people are trying to solve this problem, this hallucination problem for ministries, and they're doing a lot of good work. So I'm going to plug, a couple of organizations where we've got some friends at that I kind of went in deep on this with them. The first is Legionnaire. So, R.C. Sproul's ministry, and they've been doing a lot of work to kind of build really theologically accurate models. A lot of these are still built on like Llama's LLM, which is, Meta's large language model, or OpenAI has one, that's been well known. DeepSeek, nobody's
No, yeah, I know.
nobody
I was
that I
gonna
talk to
say,
is
I was
using
curious,
DeepSeek. I
yeah,
think
how many
everybody's
people
like,
are using it?
yeah, no. But at the beginning, I was like, you know what? Why do we always have to Christianize everything? Like, it's you've got like a popular song, that hits the Billboard charts or whatever, and then somebody just kind of rips off the style and makes a Christian version about it, and it's like kind of we see that all the time in Christian culture. But in the case of large language models, like the amount of investment that's going into like building a theologically accurate, like foundational model to run all these things on, I think is a good work. And, another group that I talked with a lot about this is Glue. So, and Glue has an AI like chat, but like a GPT product that you could plug into your church's app.
Mm.
And so they've done a lot of work to make sure that it's not hallucinating, that it's not getting some kind of head fake where if somebody says something like, oh, I understand what you're saying, but I'm offended by that. And then it'll flip, like OpenAI, if you go into Chat GPT and you're, asking it about biblical concepts and you say, well, that's really offensive to me. It'll just roll over and it'll be like, well, I don't want to be offensive, so here's a bunch of other ideas that you should consider. And there's no kind of like truth, So this is a problem that I saw a lot of ministries
Yeah,
trying to address, which
it's
I think is
interesting.
really good.
We're in the midst of changing our kind of our management system, our CRM system at our church, and we're moving to this one tool called RHMS, and so, but they have this. I've discovered on their community blog, because this is a more, I would just say,
What's
well,
what's
sometimes
H stand for in
sometimes the
HMS?
church CMSs add the H for church. So it's like I always get
Oh, I
confused because
see.
I call
I
them
got
like
you.
CMSs and or yeah, and but
So that's
then
customer management
so they
system,
add the
and
so
so
it
it's
always
H. I
confuses me
got you.
because I'm more aware of the non-church ones, and so I always have to say CHMS. But
Okay.
no, but
Sorry.
they
Go
go
ahead.
by, like, if you go to their website, it's Rock RMS, and so but it's always like it confuses my brain. I have like a hiccup in my brain when I say it out loud. But they have this like really cool tool
Right.
because it's a very technical. They're not full open source, but they work on an open code type of model, and they had this AI kind of agent feature on their community blog where they had integrated all their training on everything they do into a bot, and they call it Chip. They named it Chip because it's kind of like based off of their mascot type of scenario. But like, it's funny. I literally will I'll
Sure.
be on a meeting and they'll be like, "Hey, does Rock do this?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I'll go to the AI bot Chip, and it says ask Chip, and I'll ask Chip, and Chip spins me up an answer, and I'm like, "This is perfect." Like I was
Yeah.
on a somebody messaged me yesterday about a Google. They were having a problem with their creating a YouTube ad, and it was something odd, and they couldn't create this ad. And I literally went into my I had on my phone like a chat GP, like the app, and I just like sat there and I asked, and I was like, "Oh," I said, "Oh, did you just create the Google ad account?" And they're like, "Yeah." I go, "Oh, sometimes they lock certain features for the first 72 hours." And I found, and that's where,
Right.
like, I think people don't realize, like there's a difference between finding a website and having somebody, because like that's the thing, right? Like we look when we're look yeah, we're having
It's
to interpret
interpretation.
a lot of data points, and sometimes we just click on the top page on our Google search, where this is actually looking at thousands of pages and interpreting that data. And that's the power, and that's why a lot of people get scared about the human component of this, is this replacing humans, because there is a layer
Sure.
there. Now, this is where even that interpretation requires some nuance, and I think it will continue to get better. And this is why I think the muscle isn't going to be finding the answer. The muscle is going to be distinguishing, is that a high quality answer? And I think that's
Right.
why, and I can knock on wood here, but like, I think this is why the human is still going to be relevant. Like, I don't think that that's going away, but I think we're going to have different skill sets. The same way that if we look at our parents or our grandparents, like the skill set, like, I don't know if I'm not like my grandfather was an engineer for Boeing and Rockwell and all these he was a brilliant man. I don't think I'm smarter than my grandfather, but I think my skill sets are different. And so, and I think that's why if I look
Sure.
at my kids, or, my,
So were his.
I know,
He
yeah,
could
yeah, he
probably
can,
like
yeah.
swap out a
Yeah,
water
like
heater.
I remember growing up, he had like
So-
my grandfather passed away a couple years ago, and we were like selling his house and going through this process. And I remember growing up, he had every time you opened his slider doors in his room, the lights turned on. And he had this like when I
oh
was
yeah,
like,
awesome.
5. I remember we went in there, and my uncle is a engineer too, and we were like cleaning up the room, and I was like, "Hey, how did Grandpa like do this?" And he just had live lines. I was like, "This house can burn down
Nice.
at any point," and
Just
he's like,
open
my
wires.
uncle was like, "Yeah, but that's he would just figure it out." But but he literally just hot lines, in this like 1950s home, that could just, but you're to your point, like he had different skill sets. So I think I would say this to anybody, like, this is why, this is why you need to be just using it daily, weekly. Like, and I know even if you go, "Gee, I don't even know where to start." Like, you don't understand how far behind. trust me, like you don't need to have paid accounts to use this stuff. Like on my phone, I have
No, you don't.
ChatGPT, I have Gemini, I have Anthropic, I have, what's the other one I'm trying to remember? The Claude, yeah,
Claude,
I
maybe.
have these
Yeah.
various Grok, like I use them because I'm just, and sometimes like I just like seeing the answer. And trust me, you start using it and then you
Well,
start getting more comfortable with it. And this is why it's important that, especially in the church space and ministry space, we don't want to be behind on this, because I think we can leverage this for some really cool stuff.
yeah, I agree. My dad the other day asked me, like, how do I stay off of AI? And I was
It's
like,
too
it's
late. I
too
know
late.
it's true.
It's already in everything, Dad. Like, and I like to freak him out sometimes, but this is true. Like, if you have an iPhone and you don't change your security settings, but you just did the last update, you're running AI already, and it's gathering all your stuff. So that's something to do a search on and say, like, how do I lock down my phone? If you really want to freak yourself out, go look at that stuff. But what you're talking about, the human element, is something that I discussed with my good friend Stuart Cranny, who Stu and I worked together at CV, and he's always been a brilliant guy, but he's getting his PhD in.
Yeah.
I want to get him on this podcast and talk about this, but I'm gonna butcher it, so Stu, sorry, but I think it's AI and human agency. And so he's been doing a bunch of research about like what happens whenever we outsource our thinking to the AI. It's like your brain is like a muscle, and it will get fat and lazy to the point where you can't function if you're just outsourcing your thinking and your reasoning all the time to these things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be an interesting several years here to see what happens. And we're having that conversation in my house too, with my kids, just like trying to make them aware, like, look, these are great tools, but don't forfeit human agency. Like we need to still kind of run things through our own kind of reasoning and what we know to be true. And in the case of ministry, like a biblical context, to understand, like, is this giving us something that's right or not?
That would be a
Yeah, I
great,
want to get him on. That'll be
yeah,
a fun
I'd be
conversation.
tuning into that for sure.
So you mentioned, we've talked a little bit about our kids, and gosh, I think I feel so bad for my kids, because I feel like they are like living in a lab, because I've got Gen Z and Gen Alpha in my house, and so I'm always like, hey, what do you guys think about this? And like,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
doing my own like market research at the dinner table. But one of the things I've talked about on here, I know Bryce and I got into it a little bit. I've ranted with some other people. The gospel is being proclaimed through like non-Christian channels like I've never seen before. You've got celebrities that are being very vocal about their faith. I've mentioned, the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of times, and somebody on X posted this great thread about the the evolution of Joe Rogan
Mm-hmm.
openness to Christianity. It's because like you go way back, and there's like 30 something million people that listen to that podcast. It's like a huge audience. But you can go way back in the archives, and you can see how he's like ranting against religion, and it's fairy tales and all this stuff. But more recently, you've got like kind of this deep, inquisitive questioning about like core tenets of the Christian faith. I think I've mentioned on here. So apologies to people that have listened to me talk about this before, but I'm going somewhere. Like, I'm not just dragging up old stuff. Because this came out at the Missional AI Conference, and I'm going to play a clip here in a second that kind of confirms what I was seeing. So like conversations with Kid Rock and Mel Gibson and like all these other kind of well-known people. They're talking about what they believe about the Bible. Is it true or not? What they believe about Jesus? Like, was he a real person? Like, did he walk this earth? Did he actually raise from the dead? There's some great conversations that have been happening there. And I'm like, I was kind of thinking, I think this is really a groundswell that's happening among kind of the younger generation. And if that's true, I'm really excited about it. But I didn't have any proof until last week. David Kinnaman with Barna. David and I have talked a little bit over the years. He's he's a great guy. And one of his jokes is that Barna is often quoted to just kind of prove people's
Yeah,
I'll have an idea, or whatever.
it's
And I'll say,
true.
oh yeah, I read some Barna research, and, so they get misquoted all the time. But here it is, straight from Barna and straight from David Kinnaman. I want to share this clip with you, and then we can talk about it.
There is a headline banner statement from our research, and that is, look at the trend line. This is the percentage of all Americans who say they've made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important in their life today. There are other ways for us to measure the depth of discipleship. This is not that measure, but this is just the percentage of Americans who say they are committed to Christ, that is still important in their life. Look at the last 3 years. It bottomed out in 2021 and 2022, right after the pandemic. But the last 3 years, we are seeing the steady increase, and 66% now, 2/3 of all Americans say they've made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ. This tells us that the decline of Christianity is not inevitable. Right? This tells us that people's spiritual trajectory can still be changed.
So if you are listening to this and not watching it on YouTube or Spotify or someplace, what he's showing is this chart that goes from the year 2000 to 2025, and it kind of peaked in 2009. It looks like, with 77% of people in the U.S. adults, 77% of U.S. adults surveyed say that they've made a personal commitment to follow Jesus, and it's been on decline year over year for 11 years until the last 3 years. And he goes on to say, and he's got some other slides, later in that presentation, that shows that increase is happening among men under the age of 30, which is super interesting to me. So again, like, we kind of talked about this anecdotally, like, what are we seeing, in the world around us? But the data is actually starting to, like, visualize this trend that is occurring. Have you heard that before, or does that
Yeah, there's
match
been a
kind
lot
of
of
your
reports
experience?
lately. I think it was New York Times did one recently, like a week ago or so, around um just I don't know the exact language that the article used, but around revival. And there was this
Mm,
conversation we were having, or I'm seeing happen within church spaces with some leaders, evangelical leaders, around the turn in America specifically was so drastic that it was already proclaimed dead, the church. And the idea was they used that
right.
revival language because it was so irreversible that a revival was the only way it was going to happen, meaning the Spirit was the only one that was going to work to kind of bring it back to life. And you've seen these movements on college campuses and in places where, the Spirit is moving in ways that is very distinct.
Wasn't it? Oh, like Ohio State had a
I
huge.
keep forgetting the school names because I didn't read I just unfortunately I kept seeing the headlines. I saw so many of them, and my church
Yeah.
leadership is very attuned to this. Like, they'll share these
Mm,
stories, and so, like, it is interesting. It's funny. There is such a focus on, like, there's this thought in theology that it was kind of very popular around the Cold War era. Around it, they call it nuclear theology, where if you have a very strong view of how the end times is going to play out, that you you assume it's going to get worse, and then Jesus returns. And so what happens is, and this is why they call it nuclear theology, that you just assume the world's going to end. And so when things get worse, you just assume this is the end and Jesus is going to return. And this happened during the Cold War. Like, and so, like, so this is the leaning towards, well, we're on a decline. Well, that's just what the Bible talks about. The world's going to end. And so, but then I've always, and this is probably because I'm a very much an optimist. I My default. And so I'm like, I bet during World War II they thought the world was going to end. And so to me, when I see that, it does kind of affirm, like, the way I am. Like, I not that we know, but I'm like, I don't feel like, I feel like we could have another 1,000 years of opportunities for people to come to know Jesus. Like, I don't have this assumption that it's going to
mm.
happen in my lifetime. And so, like, to me, when I see that, that gets me really excited about, like, that's just kind of how I feel. But I don't come to conclusions off of that. Like I'm very much like, let's just see what happens. And I also see it on the flip side. I think one thing that I do know is that humans only can endure so much change. And I think there's a reason why we only live so long, because we only can endure so much change in our lifetime. And so like maybe this is why we only live 80, 100 years, because we just can't live in the new world.
Yeah.
And so there's this tension, but that makes me, especially as somebody with, teenagers and, an 8-year-old, like I pray that the thing that keeps me the most up, like if the thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night is I want the world that my kids are going to grow up in and grow old in to be a world they can thrive in. And I think there's a lot of doom and gloom with technology in the future. And I think that's probably generally always been true, but I want to have hope. And sometimes when you see some of these headlines, especially like there's political tensions and we don't know what's going to happen, and so when I see something like that, it gives me a lot of hope that, God is still moving and working, which is obviously true. But sometimes you just forget it when you're kind of, you're looking in the current moment. You kind of, and sometimes stats like that, you just lift your eyes and you go, oh, wow, stuff is happening.
Yeah. Well, I think in stressful situations, one of the best things you can do is keep a cool head, and think clearly. And I think, I think it's a good position to be fighting from, if I can use the word fight, to just like, let's see what happens. Like the Lord is in control. We can agree on that. But I think I was encouraged by, some of the tools being created in the ministry space right now, some of the ways that people are thinking about this. These are smart people too. I mean, like these, the folks that were attending that conference, they're not hacks. Like these are, top positions in Silicon Valley type of thing. And well, even Glue, and Kinnaman was talking about some of that research was done in combination with Glue. Pat Gelsinger just took over as the CEO of Glue, who is former Intel CEO, VMware CMO or CEO. Like this guy, like I've interacted with Pat a little bit over the years, and he's an outspoken Christian and an incredible like technologist, thinker, deep thinker about these things. So I was super encouraged by kind of the state of the church, the state of AI, like for mission, but also, some of the trends that we're seeing. This whole idea of, human agency, not outsourcing your thinking, dovetails really nicely with this desire that exists within all of us to exist in community. We are relational people. Like, I think that's how we were made, to relate to one another. And a New York Times article that I read recently was talking about young men that were kind of being drawn back to the Orthodox Church of all things. So it's kind of like this rejection of technology back to the traditions, the disciplines. Like there's among young people, and especially young men in the US today, there's kind of like, you know what, I'm done with like the easy stuff. It's unfulfilling. Like if I can just fulfill all of my desires, like I'm not working for anything. Like there's like, what's the point of this? Just like live your life consuming, a life of ease and then die. Like there's got to be something bigger than that. And so there's kind of this kind of move back towards kind of these spiritual disciplines and doing that in a community with people that, share those same values. So anyway, I think the outcome of all of this for me, or kind of where it comes down to, is now is not the time to shrink back. I think now is the time to kind of lean in. There's an interest and a willingness and even like a desire to have some of these conversations. And I think a lot of the work that you're doing, with your church and then also with MII, I think is a great example of this. Like the world has questions. AI, ChatGPT, whatever, can answer some of them, but people are starting to question the answers. And I think having a, face-to-face, one-on-one conversation about like what is truth, what is real, is something that's very, very desirable. And so I hope ministry teams can lead into that opportunity.
Totally agree. I think my encouragement, I hope, is somebody who's listening, watching this, is There's a lot of stuff to still figure out, but I think this AI stuff is not a fad. Like you gotta be using it, and it's okay to be a little nervous about it. But I would encourage you that just start strengthening that muscle. You know, it's again that concept. I use that language of strengthening a muscle because the way you build muscle is you break down the muscle to build it back up. And and in this concept, you start prompting, you start using it. It doesn't mean you got to use all that stuff. You just start messing around with it. I'm always reminded whenever I'm in a new place, like if you travel somewhere, your initial feeling is to feel unsettled because you don't know where north is. But a day in, 2 days in, it starts feeling like home and you feel comfortable. And I think anything new you're doing, especially in the technology area, you're going to feel a little unsettled. You're going to feel out of your place, but then you start feeling comfortable and then you start thriving. And this is why you just got to be using it weekly, daily. And trust me, it will start to make sense. The fog will start to leave and it will like, oh, this is how I use it.
Jay, thanks for the insight. Always appreciate you
Yep.
chatting. Let's do it again soon.